What's going on, y'all? Shout out to the LDBC. It's your boy Fight Critic here to give you guys another video. So Dillian Whyte did an interview, either it was yesterday or today, depending on where your time zone is, and he was talking about, you know, he was talking about essentially Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder, and he's talking about how he feels that their records are massively inflated in that they are both cherry pickers. And he mostly spent his time calling out Tyson Fury as a cherry pick. So he says that Tyson Fury is a cherry picker because he fought Deontay Wilder, which I found to be very interesting from reading this article. So there was three main key takeaways I took away from it. His first reason for behind his statements was that Fury's win over Vladimir Klitschko wasn't legit. He says that Vladimir wasn't himself psychologically that night, and that because Vladimir has instances where he shows up to fights and he doesn't show up to fights, that ultimately led to Tyson Fury choosing to retire and not take the rematch against Vladimir Klitschko. And then he goes on to call that they don't have as many wins that he has against the top 10 in the heavyweight division. And he does a citation where he uses a reference from Ring Magazine. Obviously, Ring Magazine, in my opinion, the list can be very hit or miss depending on how you look at how a fighter's set up. A lot of people like to use Ring Magazine's rankings mostly because we have so many belt organizations, and it's hard to kind of gauge who is, top 10 once you get past the champions. Me personally, I think you got to factor everything into place, but I also think it's super important that when you're looking at how you rank guys, you also got to look at, a multitude of things, fighting style, recent resume, which I think the recent resume holds more weight than the overall resume. And I think when I look at, a bunch of what he said in here, and I'm going to debunk a lot of that. And then he says that Fury's win over Wilder, he felt that it wasn't legit due to the fact that had he fought Wilder before Fury, that he would have done what Fury would have done in the rematch against Wilder. So I found those to be some really interesting statements that Dillian Whyte had made. Now, for a lot of the people who may be like massive fans of Dillian Whyte, him saying this actually discredits him. And it doesn't really, not from the sense of what he's saying is is discrediting him as a fighter and his opinion on guys. No, but it's discrediting what Whyte has been trying to do for the last 3 years, which is he's been trying to win a championship. Dillian Whyte has never been a world champion. For all the talk and all the amount of propaganda that's kind of like around him, and for all the shit that people have overlooked and all the shit that people have dealt with for him, he has yet to even step into a title fight. And for him to say a lot of these things, in my opinion, it sounds like a bunch of sour grapes and a bunch of bullshit. And for many reasons, here's why. When Tyson Fury fought Vladimir Klitschko had recently broken the record title defenses for a heavyweight champion. A record that has stood decades in the sport, maybe even close to a century in the sport, and if you want to gauge that huge era. There have been guys like Mike Tyson, Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, Lennox Lewis, Michael Spinks, Larry Holmes. All these guys were not able to do what Vladimir Klitschko was able to do in terms of title defenses. Now, if you want to criticize those title defenses, that's a different point. But to say that Tyson Fury was taking advantage of Vladimir Klitschko is bullshit. And the reason why it's bullshit is because you have to look at the fact that Vladimir Klitschko was a 3-belt champion. Held the WBA title, the IBF title, the WBO title, and was a lineal champion. And Fury won all his titles legitimately. He didn't, reach out and ask some belt organization to put the title on the line. He didn't, force guys to give up their titles so that Vladimir Klitschko from 2005 up until 2015, those 10 years of dominance, those 10 years were Tyson Fury hunting down champion after champion, beating mandatory challenger after mandatory challenge, beating other guys as mandatory. And then he stepped into the ring against Tyson Fury and he got absolutely embarrassed. Now, for whatever reason that he feels that Tyson Fury was taking advantage of Klitschko from a psychological level, that's not Tyson Fury's fault. If Vladimir Klitschko was being affected by the mental aspect of the sport, that says more about him than it does about Fury. It just says that Fury is able to reach on a more deeper level in order to get his opponent out of their game plan. Now, mind you, this was also at the fact that Fury had everything put against him in the Klitschko fight. And for a lot of people who have probably, especially nowadays, haven't really looked at that fight, I remember that fight very vividly. Tyson Fury had to travel to Germany, where Vladimir Klitschko, in terms of boxing, is like God, to be honest. And I think even still to today, Vladimir Klitschko is still held to massive regard in Germany, just because of the fact that he was the only real big name fighter that was really utilizing, them as a hub more than any of their local fighters. And Vladimir Klitschko isn't even German. But for Klitschko, he had the opportunity to get the fight when he wanted it. And also at the same time, Tyson Fury had to not only go into Germany, have no real control over the fight, and then Klitschko's team tried to contaminate the ring. So not only did they pick the smallest ring that was legally available to them, which is something that a lot of fighters do when they hold a lot of leverage versus a fighter who utilizes their movement. Case point and example, Oscar De La Hoya did the same thing to Floyd Mayweather back in 2007 when they fought. But Klitschko also, well, I can't really say it's Klitschko. Maybe his people, maybe they asked the board, the German board, to do this, but they put a thick ass foam mat as like the top layering of the ring. And I remember them looking at videos of Fury's in the ring, and if you see Fury stepping into the ring, his foot is sinking into the canvas. And that's the kind of padding that they had cleared for this fight. And then Fury had them investigated. They stripped it off. They went with the usual type matting, which was way better for guys who are going to be moving around the ring. So the fact that Fury had to do all that, how can you honestly say that because Vlad wasn't mentally in the fight, that the win isn't legit? Even though this guy for 10 years was the man in the division. Broke. Oh, man. Oh, man. How do you break the Bronx Bombers' heavyweight resume? And then you have this motherfucker here talking about, oh, the win wasn't legit. Do people not realize just how... Do you not realize how much you discredit yourself to doing that? Then that means that every dude that has beaten Klitschko, in your opinion, doesn't deserve the credit. And then he takes matters to a step further. Now, I think the only thing that he has some legitimacy to is this talk about him fighting top 10 heavyweights. And he feels that these other guys, he says that these guys haven't won as many top 10 heavyweight fights as him. He says, and he explicitly says that both Wilder and Fury have only beaten one top 10 heavyweight apiece. I'm sure he's alluding to the fact that he probably doesn't consider Wilder a top 10 heavyweight, which is kind of stupid. And it further discredits him. But it's also, you're talking about that, you don't consider Fury to be also a top 10 heavyweight, which also kind of discredits your point anyway. You're saying both these guys aren't top 10 heavyweights because you said they've only beaten one and that you've beaten 3 top 10 heavyweights. So I'm not going to spend much time focusing on the top 10 heavyweights Dillian Whyte has fought. I'm going to focus on debunking this whole Wilder and Fury have only beaten one top 10 heavyweight. So let's talk about it, because these are really, really easy things that you can easily just say that's complete and utter bullshit. So in 2014, Bermane Stiverne, by the same ranking that Dillian Whyte is using to justify his opinion, I should say, was ranked number 2 in the heavyweight division going into 2015. That is correct. There was Vladimir Klitschko, and then there was, I think it was Klitschko, and I think right underneath Klitschko, it was Stiverne, and you had like these two guys who were ranked, 1 and 2. So going into that year, you had both those guys. I think only Alexander Povetkin might have been maybe ranked above Bermane Stiverne. I think it was Klitschko champion, Povetkin, and then Bermane Stiverne. But Stiverne was ranked number 2. And obviously Wilder beat Stiverne on a decision, a wide decision. And after that, going into 2015, Stiverne was placed sixth place. Now, going into the rematch, a rematch that Wilder didn't even want to take, a rematch that we really didn't give a fuck about. Bermane Stiverne was ranked 7th by the same ranking that Dillian Whyte is using to justify himself. And this was mostly ordered because Don King has his influence on the WBC. He lobbied the WBC to award Stiverne the mandatory because Alexander Povetkin thought it was a good idea to take Ostarine. And he got popped for a PED. Despite the fact, Stiverne also got popped for a PED. But because it was a energy drink, and I put air quotes around it, they allowed Stiverne to keep his position. But they wanted Stiverne to fight a mandatory replacement. That replacement being Luis Ortiz. Don King and Stiverne said, oh, no. We are not fighting Luis Ortiz. Clear duck, I should say. And mind you, in 2018, the year that Wilder was going to fight Luis Ortiz was ranked 5th going into that fight. Despite the fact that Luis Ortiz also had a situation with drug testing. And I think ultimately when it came down to Luis Ortiz, he actually ended up getting a physical, and then doctors kind of clarified the situation. Like, it was much different from the Povetkin Meldonium situation, where like doctors was just like, oh yeah, no, like he actually had some health problems. But it was something that he was medically, cleared to take. But even then, I'm not going to use it as a way to justify this situation. But based off of the Ring magazine that Dillian Whyte is using to justify himself, Luis Ortiz is ranked 5th going into the Wilder fight. And then Wilder fights Tyson Fury to a draw, and this is at a time where Tyson Fury is technically unranked. But for Tyson Fury, he's technically reinstated as the number 1 heavyweight in the division, or number 2 heavyweight in the division, right before the fight, because he was retired. That's why they took him out of the rankings. He came back and they put him like number 1 or number 2. So I'm not going to count Tyson Fury's sudden re-inclusion into 2018 on this, but I'm just letting you know about the situation. But in 2019, Wilder has to fight Luis Ortiz for a second time, mostly because, number 1, a lot of people complained about the fact that Deontay Wilder in, I believe it was round, I forgot what round it was, but there was a round where Luis Ortiz caught Wilder with a straight left punch and it dazed him, but Luis Ortiz couldn't finish it. Like, he couldn't finish Wilder off. And he kept hitting him, and Wilder kind of put his high guard up and just kind of kept, trying to take away space from Ortiz to try to land some punches. And in the end, it ultimately led to the round being over. It was a huge round for Luis Ortiz. Some people scored it a 10-8 round as if it was a knockdown. Not really mad about that. I was in person for that fight. He had no idea how many British people were excited, by the way. But yeah, they had a great fight. And then before the next round, you saw the New York State Athletic Commission's doctor observe Wilder, ask him if he was okay, do a real quick clearing on him, and they let the fight continue. And for some reason, a ton of people were upset at that. They felt that, oh, that this is clearly something that's being rigged. I don't like it. This is something that they're doing while they're paid off the refs. Despite the fact that if you had just done a little bit of history, you'd known that this was actually something that the New York State Athletic Commission had been doing for months before this fight took place. And they did it in the beginning of 2018. They did it in the beginning of the year when James DeGale fought against Badu Jack. Why? Because Mike Perez thought it was a good idea to turn a guy into a vegetable about 2 years prior, and a guy who sued the New York State Athletic Commission and was awarded $20 million because it was deemed that the commission did not do proper judgment and using their ringside doctors to observe if Magmadov was actually conscious for their fight against Mike Perez. That fight also changed the trajectory of Mike Perez's career. He felt that he was essentially responsible for this, despite the fact that this was the doctor's fault and the ring referee's fault for not actually taking the time out to observe Magmadov before he ended up being a vegetable. So because of that, the New York State Athletic Commission put in a rule that if a fighter sustains a heavy amount of damage, leaving a round in which you can tell that they could potentially be concussed, you are to allow them to actually go through the break period and then observe them to make sure that their vitals are correct and before the next round. And what happened when Badu Jack fought James DeGale? In round 9, Badu Jack absolutely knocked the teeth out of James DeGale, and that is a fact. James DeGale lost teeth. He lost his guard. He was getting absolutely beaten up for that entire round. Very next round, doctor observes James DeGale, makes sure that he's okay. And this also happened when Sean Porter fought Danny Garcia. Danny Garcia, one of the rounds, he was taking a lot of heavy punishment. What ended up happening in the next round? They observed Danny Garcia, make sure he's okay, make sure his vitals are okay. They did the same thing in this fight. But no, this is an issue for you guys. I find that to be hilarious. Not quite. But in 2020, he fights Tyson Fury again, who's now officially ranked number 1, and he loses that fight. So Wilder overall, when you look at his resume against the top 10 in the division, he's 4-1-1, and he's fought 3 guys in the top 10. He's fought Stiverne Ortiz, and he's fought Tyson Fury, you know? And for Fury, in 2015, he beats the lineal champion. And then in 2020, he beats Wilder, who was the 3rd ranked heavyweight. That's already 2 guys. And for Fury, when it comes to this whole aspect to discrediting Fury's win over Wilder, it sounds like sour grapes simply because Dillian Whyte is pissed off at the fact that he didn't get the opportunity to fight Deontay Wilder when he was a champion. But ultimately, that is Dillian Whyte's fault. Whyte paraded with a WBC silver title as if that meant something. A WBC silver champion has never become the mandatory for the title. It's never happened on a consistent basis. Every time I've seen somebody with that bullshit belt, they always want to talk about, oh, I'm the mandatory, I'm the mandatory. Like, no, you're not. You just have a title that allows the WBC to be like, hey, we need an extra little bit of percentage from you, homie. And they're willing to parade you around. That's what you were. You were pimped for the heavyweight division. And you had countless opportunities to actually line yourself up for a legitimate title shot years ago. When Stiverne pulled that bullshit with Luis Ortiz. When he was just like, no, not fighting Luis Ortiz to be mandatory. You're mandatory that was supposed to fight me, got tested positive for a drug. And even though I tested positive for a drug, it was really an energy drink. But because of that, I feel like I should be able to fight for the legitimate title. And so you got to do something else with those guys. So what did the WBC do? WBC, like the bitches that they can be sometimes, is they caved to that. They caved to Don King and Stiverne and says, hey, you know what? Let's give them this title fight. And for guys like Dillian Whyte, who we are parading with this silver title so that we can take an extra bit of money from him when he fights, let's offer him the opportunity to become a secondary mandatory so that when Wilder beats Stavern, which kind of what we all expected, the winner of Whyte versus an opponent to be named will be the mandatory that is up next. So what happens? Dillian Whyte turns down that opportunity. Why? Because he chooses to go to life and death over 2 fights with Derek Chisora. And in that space, you know who he could have fought to actually get a shot? Luis Ortiz. And before anybody's like, oh, if he would have fought Ortiz, he would have never, become a mandatory had he won. So then why did Deontay Wilder just end up fighting Luis Ortiz after? You see how that doesn't help your argument? You see how stupid that looks to say that he should have continued to fight Derek Chisora over Luis Ortiz? See how stupid that sounds? Especially because Luis Ortiz ends up getting 2 fights against Wilder following. You see how dumb that looks? And the whole time, instead of Dillian Whyte saying, you know what? Let me actually go grab the next mandatory, which is Dominic Breazeale. No. So Dominic Breazeale, who all of a sudden, he was good enough for Anthony Joshua to make a title defense, but he's not good enough for Dillian Whyte to become a mandatory? Are you stupid? Are you high? How are you going to be upset that you are not getting a title shot when you are clearly choosing not to put yourself to win a title? And then when you finally get the opportunity and you're like, you know what? The WBC is like, you know what? We're going to make the winner of Dillian Whyte versus Oscar Rivas the interim champion. And I think that's going to be super important. You know what, Dillian? We're willing to work with you. And what do? You take one of the most well-known anabolic fucking steroids in the world that almost every single legendary bodybuilder has abused. Fucking Dianabol. And then you sit there and then you kind of just, stay quiet. You blocked me on Twitter when I called you out for it because obviously that's not something that you wanted. And then the British Board of Boxing pulls one of the biggest ass pulls ever with this. And for me, I'm looking at this and I'm just like, how the fuck do you test positive for Dianabol? It's your second offense. It's fucking Dianabol. It's clear cut. We're not talking about some new special magical potion that's like different and it's kind of it's held under the light differently. Scientists are just using ways to extract. No, it's fucking Dianabol, bro. Like this is something that like guys have abused for the last 40 to 50 years in bodybuilding. Fucking Dianabol. And all of a sudden it's, oh, well, you got to think about, the picograms, the nanograms, the trifectograms, the nanotechs, you got to go to Wakanda and figure it out. Like, dude, it's fucking Dianabol, bro. It's clear cut. You find any top level professional who does any sort of bodybuilding, any sort of physical activity that's a sport, that drug, the minute they find it, it's over. There's no, we need to investigate it. You test positive for a Dianabol, it's clear cut. You cheated. It's not some magical stuff that just is prescribed to people. No, Dianabol, we know what Dianabol does to people. Like, do you know the amount of people that have had to have their fucking kidneys replaced because of Dianabol? Because of abusing it that much? Like, it's not something that's meant for everyday people to just be like, oh yeah, my doctor prescribes me Dianabol. No. Dianabol has a specific purpose when it comes to athletes. And it's not, trying to get them to, feel more lively or some shit like that. They're not using it as dick pills. At least I don't think so. But yeah, you test positive for a Dianabol and the British board is willing to overlook it so that this way they don't have to hand you a lifetime ban, which I find to be hilarious because your career is done after that. And then you come back and you fight Alexander Povetkin, who I don't hold Alexander Povetkin to high standards because he's a guy who has not only abused a doping system that has been perfected in the countries that he's from, but he's also just been real sloppy after he got caught. And for many of us, we had our suspicions about Alexander Povetkin, and then those situations kind of came to light. It's always fucking funny to me how every time we have a prominent black fighter who is, well established, and he's going into the ring and he's getting an opportunity to fight somebody, and he's like, hey, it'd be great. It would be great if we did drug testing. And then you got fans who are just like, oh, so you scared? I just want to do some drug testing. Yeah, that sounds like you're scared. Now I'm willing to do the same type of drug testing. They're like, oh no, he's scared. But when the same black fighter gets caught for PEDs, all of a sudden this person deserves to be prosecuted as if they murdered somebody. I find it so hilarious how it's put that way. There's no consistency in terms of the criticism. But when you sit there and you discredit Fury versus Wilder, and you say that Fury hasn't fought hasn't beaten any top 10 champions or top 10 fighters the way that you have, and that, had you fought Wilder prior, you would have won. So if that's the case, then why for the last 3 years have you been trying to fight Deontay Wilder if he's a cherry pick for Tyson Fury? Are you saying that if you fought Tyson Fury, that's a cherry pick? If he's been cherry picking? Are you saying that if Joshua beats Fury, that's not a legitimate win because Tyson Fury has been cherry picking fighters? You see how stupid it is to make statements like that? Because ultimately you are discrediting the entire top 10 of the heavyweight division and saying that you are the person that validates the top 10 heavyweight division because they fight you. Meanwhile, less than a year ago, you were being absolutely knocked out cold. And then, despite the fact that this old motherfucker ended up getting COVID, ended up being hospitalized, you feel like that win solidifies more than anything of what these guys ahead of you have done. It doesn't make sense. And for Dillian Whyte, and I've said this before time and time again, if you wanted to be a champion and win, titles and be recognized, and I said this a really long time ago, you would have taken that offer to fight Joshua in the rematch, but you didn't. And one of the big reasons why you did it, and I'm going to be honest, it's because you don't believe in yourself. And you'd much rather be in a position where you can talk and you can be in positions where like the leverage is pushed, in your favor. You will never consider yourself to be the type of fighter where you will do anything of what these gentlemen ahead of you will have to do. You have never put yourself in a position to where you can be vulnerable. You've only fought the guys that are willing to give you the leverage.